Hi, good afternoon. On behalf of the Armenian Cultural Foundation Board of Trustees, I welcome and thank you for taking time to join us in this beautiful afternoon supporting our first event of the fall of 2025. One of the controversial aspects of history of Armenian genocide to this day has been the role and alleged involvement of Germany in support and execution of various operations throughout the Ottoman Empire. Approximately 8,000 German officers, as a part of a larger force of around 18,000 soldiers in the ASEAN Corps or Asian Corps, were involved in the Ottoman Empire during World War I, providing military assistance and advice in the Middle Eastern theater. This German military presence included advising the Ottoman High Command and serving in the general staff, as well as commanding specific expeditions such as the Pasha I expedition. The views on the role of Germany and German officers in Armenian genocide has been mixed, most painting a negative picture of their participation in crushing the pockets of Armenian resistance and organizing the mass deportations towards the Syrian desert. Of all the top German military commanders, perhaps one of the most prominent was Otto Victor Karl Liman von Sanders, an Imperial German Army general who played a major role in the reorganization of the Ottoman army and served as a military advisor to the Ottoman High Command. As a result, Liman von Sanders was among a select number of German military officers whose name and legacy has been tarnished and marred in controversy for his direct or indirect involvement in various operations connected to the Armenian genocide. Our distinguished scholar and writer Muriel Mirak-Weissbach, in her new book, based on years of extensive research and in the official and family archives and records, will provide a different angle and analysis on the life and legacy of Liman von Sanders, one of the brilliant military strategists of the World War I. For some of you who may not be familiar with Muriel and her work, she is an Armenian American, is a graduate of Wellesley College and Fulbright scholar who completed graduate studies in State University of Milan. She has published number of articles on politics and culture in the Arab and Islamic world and Armenia, as well as essays on literature and philology. Her previous books, also published in German and Arabic translations, are Through the Wall of Fire, Armenia, Iraq, Palestine, From Wrath to Reconciliation, Madness at the Helm, Pathology and Politics in the Arab Spring, Turkish Foreign Policy under the AKP Beirut, published in Beirut. She is the Berlin correspondent for the Armenian Mirror Spectator and board member of the Armenian Cultural Foundation. Muriel lives in Germany with her husband, where in 2012 they established Mirak-Weissbach Stiftung or Foundation, a small foundation supporting cultural, educational, and social projects in Armenia. Before turning the podium to Muriel, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, National Armenian Association for Armenian Studies and Research, Goethe Institute, Tekeyan Cultural Association, and Bergen Publishing, as well as, of course, Arlington Cable Media Incorporated, or ACMi, for their support making today's event possible, which, by the way, is the first event of the ACF that is live streamed. Now, without further ado, it is my honor to invite Muriel Mirak-Weissbach to the podium to share her findings on the life and legacy of this major World War I German military figure. After the talk, of course, you're more than welcome to continue, ask your questions if you have more questions. Of course, her book will also be available for sale. And of course, you can also join us for the reception afterwards at the conclusion. Okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Ara, for the very kind introduction and for all the effort you put into organizing this event. And I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this event. I'd also like to dedicate these remarks to the memory of my brother Bob, Robert Mirak, who passed away 2 months ago, and whose knowledge and advice were of great benefit to this book, as all my books. You might have asked yourselves, why should we be concerned with the story of Otto Liman von Sanders, a Prussian general who died almost 100 years ago, and whose name has been largely forgotten, even in his native country, Germany?
Speak up a little, please, or use the microphone.
Is it not on?
It is on.
Oh, maybe bring it a little closer to you.
Should I put it up? Or? I apologize for laryngitis, a little bit of a hoarse voice. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. You might have asked yourselves, why should we be concerned with the story of Otto Liman von Sanders, a Prussian general who died almost 100 years ago, and whose name has been largely forgotten, even in his native country, Germany? Let me tell you how I became acquainted with this story, what prompted me to write this book, and what I found out. About 10 years ago, a German-Canadian historian, Fred Kautz, came to me for help in the case of Liman von Sanders. In 2015, the centenary of the Armenian Genocide, city authorities in Darmstadt, a city in the German federal state of Hessen, decided to remove the so-called honor status that had been given Liman for his grave in the cemetery, the old cemetery in Darmstadt. Honor graves, Ehrengräber in German, are granted to prominent citizens in recognition of their contributions as intellectuals, artists, statesmen, philosophers, freedom fighters, resistance fighters, and so on. A historian's commission had reviewed all such graves in the cemetery and stripped 7 names of this honor, including Liman's. He, along with 2 others, had been degraded because they had been honored solely for military achievements. Fred Kautz contested this, arguing that the general deserved special recognition not as a military hero, but because he intervened during World War I to save thousands of Armenians and Greeks from the genocide perpetrated by the Young Turk regime between 1915 and 1918. The Commission refused to acknowledge this, and even went so far as to allege that the general must have been involved in the atrocities himself. This paradox disturbed me, shocked me, and intrigued me, not only for academic reasons, but also for very personal ones. Both my parents were orphans, survivors of the genocide, who had been rescued by kind-hearted Turks. If a German general had also saved Armenians from slaughter, I wanted to know more. Who was he? Where was he during the war? And what did he do? If he did stop the deportations, when and where? And what motivated him? Why has he not been recognized? I would learn that he was in fact imprisoned after the war as a war criminal. Why? And by whom? In 8 years of research in state, university, and family archives of Liman's descendants, I found massive documentation which allowed me to put together the pieces of a complex puzzle and relate the incredible story of this man. I found that he repeatedly and successfully opposed the deportation orders coming from the War Ministry of Enver Pasha, preventing their implementation or stopping those already in progress. And as a result, thousands of Armenians, as well as Greeks, escaped death. He also intervened to protect numerous Jews. For scholars, this is a matter of historical truth. For descendants of genocide survivors, it is a moral question of justice. And his story poses certain questions confronting us today. We're dealing with the horrors of war, or wars, better, and with the so-called moral principles of warfare. Then, in 1915, it was the Armenians among many victims. Ara, could we perhaps see the first slide? Ah, there it is, sorry. Again, 2 years ago in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenians were being expelled from their homeland by Azerbaijan. And there are many, many more today, of course, whether in Ukraine, in Sudan, or in Israel, Palestine, to name only the most dramatic theaters of recent and current conflict. It's the innocent civilians who bear the greatest suffering. They are the ones who are deported, expelled, wounded, and killed. In the public realm, we hear talk of the need to respect the so-called rules of warfare, to protect civilians. What does that actually involve? What does it mean? Next. Let me briefly review the events. Otto Liman von Sanders was born on February 17, 1885 in Stolp, which is today in Poland, and pursued a military career, rapidly rising through the ranks, through the Prussian War Academy to a general staff position. As the leader of the German military mission sent to Constantinople in 1913, he commanded the Ottoman Fifth Army, which was a coalition of German, Turkish, and Austro-Hungarian forces. In 1915, he commanded them in the Battle of the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. Next. But before he reached that theater, as early as February 1915, he received reports in Constantinople of unrest among Greeks in Ayvalık on the west coast, and he traveled there to ensure that the Turkish officials, quote, avoid any provocative behavior that might lead to conflict, unquote. Then, when the mass arrests of Armenians, intellectuals, community leaders, professionals, and clergy began on April 24th in Constantinople, he had already left the capital. In fact, a month earlier, on March 25th, he had assumed command of the Fifth Army in Gallipoli, where he led the defense of the attempted land invasion of the Allied forces. And he remained there until the end of the year, after the evacuation of the Allies. Now, the April 24th mass roundups represented the start of the genocide, as most people know. Genocide planned and executed by the Young Turk regime, led by especially Interior Minister Mehmet Talat and War Minister Ismail Enver. Next, please. The April deportations became the model for what was to unfold elsewhere from Cilicia, North Syria, and Anatolia. On orders from the Interior Ministry, the provincial governors, called valis, rounded up first the civilian and religious leaders, the elite of the Armenian communities. They led them outside the villages and towns. The able-bodied men and boys, from 16 to 50, even up to 70 years of age, were shot or were forced to work in labor battalions. Next came the women and children, aged 12 or older. And the very last group were the aged, the infirm, the very sick, and the very small children. To weaken them, the gendarmes, the military police, the Turks, often locked them up in churches for days and nights before leading them out into the fields where they were then shot. For those deported on foot, death came through hunger, thirst, sickness, rape, drowning, or the desert heat. And for the few who survived the death marches, the final destination was the concentration camp at Deir el-Zor in the Mesopotamian desert. You can see the big red circle at the bottom. And these are the deportation routes from the towns and cities. So it was all very well planned. The gendarmes and soldiers led the death marches, aided by criminal death squads known as the Special Organization, Teşkilat-i Mahuse. The aim was genocide. And between 1915 and 1923, estimates vary greatly, but at least 1.5 million Armenians out of a population of 2 million or more perished. What did Liman von Sanders know about these events? He was in contact with Constantinople even during the Gallipoli campaign, and he must have learned about the mass roundups. But it is highly unlikely that he could have done anything about it in late April from Gallipoli. However, in February 1916, after the end of the Gallipoli campaign, when he received a report that the governor of Adrianople, today Edirne, northwest of Constantinople, had ordered the expulsion of all Armenians and Jews from the city, Liman went to Constantinople immediately, and supported by the German and Austrian ambassadors, he succeeded in reversing the order. In March 1916, he moved his command center to Panderma on the Sea of Marmara, where he countered the plans of the Young Turks against the Greeks. At the beginning of May, in fact, the Ottoman forces opened an attack on the island of Kirsten, which was near the coastal cities of Urla and Izmir, which were both inhabited by Greeks and Armenians, and had been bombed by the British armed forces. The British had then retreated, but the Turks wanted to pursue plans to evacuate the Greek population from Urla, allegedly to protect them. A leading representative of the Greek community, Dr. Konstantin Makris, and the Greek ambassador, Dimitrios Kalergis, appealed to Liman, because he was the military commander on site, as well as to the German ambassador, Graf von Metternich, for help. Liman reached Urla as the deportations had already begun, and he ordered the immediate halt. On August 2nd, an order came to deport the Greeks, again, from the coastal regions. The order was signed by, believe it or not, a German military officer, Lieutenant General Bronsart von Schellendorf, the man who was Enver's chief of staff. Liman rejected the order as, quote, in no way appropriate, unquote, and gave economic as well as military reasons for his decision. The order was stopped. The Greek residents of the village and the peninsula of Kyzikos were also protected by Liman. And there is even more. During his stay in Panderma, he set up an orphanage for 180 Greek and Armenian orphans, financing it out of his own pocket. In November 1916, he prevented the forced removal of Armenians from Smyrna, Izmir, threatening to use force, military force, against Turkish troops, and he was commanding Turkish troops. At the same time, he ordered the valley in Urla to release a number of Greeks who had been unjustly arrested. According to estimates published by Johannes Lepsius, the German pastor and humanitarian who documented the genocide case by case, as a result of Liman's efforts in this case, about 27 Armenians in Smyrna and vicinity survived. In April 1917, Liman did allow one deportation to occur in Ayvalık, the same city where 2 years earlier he had managed to establish calm. This time he was told by Turkish officials that the Greek residents had been in contact with the enemy, i.e. the British, and they were planning a landing in Ayvalık. The residents were supposed to be evacuated for their own safety, as the wording went, and Liman agreed, on condition that only those Greeks whose complicity could be proven were to be removed. In summer, he revoked the entire order because the dimensions of the operation were excessive. In June 1917, he laid down the law that no Greeks living in areas under his jurisdiction would be removed. And in December, he succeeded in forcing Enver to rescind an order to deport Greeks from the coast. From the beginning of March 1918, to the armistice at the end of October of that year, Liman was no longer deployed there, but in Palestine. But even in Palestine, he countered Enver's orders, this time to send all Jews from the 7th and 8th Army to the Caucasus. In about every case, Liman argued on grounds of the so-called military rationale to justify his resistance against these deportation orders. And for obvious reasons, the Young Turks had always claimed that they had to deport civilians, to evacuate them, to move them from conflict zones to secure zones, which of course was a pure lie. Liman, who considered Enver an egocentric, incompetent dilettante, used his own position as German general and commander, Ottoman group commander, to make clear that there were absolutely no military grounds for the expulsions. In addition, he had received orders from the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, not to interfere in Turkish domestic politics. Liman used the so-called military rationale because that was the only means at his disposal. However, in his reports to Berlin on these incidents, he stressed the suffering of women and children hauled out of bed in the middle of the night, the danger that if the men were deported, the families would have no means of subsistence, or the fact that the harvest would be sacrificed, leading to hunger. In short, there appeared to be a humanitarian impulse. So much for the record of Liman's interventions in support of Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. According to the Armistice Agreement of October 30th, 1918, German officers and soldiers were to return to Germany. As the highest-ranking officer, Liman was given the responsibility for organizing their repatriation, which he did. And he did it in constant contact with the British General Staff in Constantinople, the British who had meantime occupied. Next photo, please. British Admiral Sir Somerset Arthur Gouge Calthorpe, who you see here, in charge of the operation, agreed to Liman's proposal to use direct sea transport for the Germans to Germany. And on January 29th, the German ship Eta Ricmus sailed under the flag of the Allied Naval Mission. Next photo, please. There you see Liman, I think he's fifth from fifth from the right on ship, and that is in Malta. The steamship with Liman, 120 officers and 1,800 soldiers on board, arrived on February 3rd at Malta, a British crown colony, where it was supposed to refuel with coal. For 3 weeks, the ship idled in the bay until a uniformed English lieutenant captain came on board with the order to accompany Liman on land. General Liman assumed that it could be the occasion to discuss questions related to the transport with the Malta governor. So he went. As soon as he set foot on Maltese soil, however, he was arrested and declared a prisoner of war of the British government. He was locked up in a solitary cell in Fort Ricasoli, where he would remain until August. No one told him why he had been arrested and what he was charged with. Meanwhile, the British and French press in Constantinople were carrying allegations that he, Liman von Sanders, was behind the massacres. In the months of his imprisonment, two narratives unfold in parallel. On the one hand was the secret correspondence and the nervous discussion between British and French, as well as among the British personnel themselves, regarding the search for evidence to uphold the accusations against him. The Paris Peace Conference had opened, and on the agenda was the question of who had been responsible for the outbreak of war and for the atrocities committed. On the other hand, there was the prisoner Liman in his cell, frantically involved in proving his innocence. Although officially, again, he was never charged with any concrete actions. The entire affair was Kafkaesque, and it reads almost like a crime novel. What is certain is that the Allies wanted to punish him as the leading war criminal behind the massacres in a show trial before the whole world. King George V himself gave the order. Calthorpe, the same man who was coordinating Liman's free passage to Germany under British flag, had informed the British king of atrocities that he claimed Liman had committed. He gave a whole list. And the message then for the British delegation at the Paris Peace Conference was, quote, "His Majesty trusts that no mercy or pity will be shown him, Liman, and that everything possible will be done to bring him to justice," unquote. As I note in my book, for those who believe in the divine right of kings, this was tantamount to a mandate from heaven. With this order, diplomats, the secret services, the military and political establishments in Britain conducted a months-long search for evidence of his crimes, but in vain. The British could find nothing, nor could the French. After Liman had been sending daily complaints and appeals to every imaginable government authority he could think of, through the mediation of Danish consul William Gulcher, next please, on Malta, he, Liman, finally did succeed in obtaining evidence, often classified material by way of confidential diplomatic channels, which could provide, in fact, material to prove his innocence. How and from whom he received the material is not known, but I think I developed a plausible hypothesis. At the end of a long, nerve-wracking process, he finally was freed in August. Later, when he wrote about it, he said, quote, "On 16 August, the aide-de-camp of the governor of Malta came to me with the news that I would be able to leave for Germany in the coming days. The reason for my liberation was never communicated to me, so that still today I know neither who and what caused my arrest, nor what occasioned my release," end quote. Following his liberation and return to Germany, Liman published articles, held lectures, and gave interviews in which he repeatedly denied the allegations against him. When asked during one interview about the reason behind his imprisonment, he said, quote, "The English course of action against me cannot be understood other than as a petty vendetta against the general who defeated the English in so many battles. Their conduct sheds a revealing light on the English talk of law and justice," unquote. Next picture. Liman died in 1929, was buried in Darmstadt, where, as I said, he was granted the Grave of Honor. The fact that this status was withdrawn in 2015 marked the starting point of renewed controversy regarding his role in the genocide. Actually, the occurrence of the centenary itself opened up debate in Germany about the role of Germans in the genocide. There are several questions raised by the Liman saga. Why, if these are the facts, is Liman's name still tainted with guilt? Allegations come not only from British, German, and French sources, but also from Armenian scholars. There are some historians who hold the entire German military leadership responsible, and Liman in particular, because they argue that the German commander could have at least prevented the genocide, given that he had dictatorial powers. The documents show that he had no such dictatorial powers. It was the imperial government in Berlin, not the German military in Turkey, who determined imperial policy. And Berlin's policy was defined by Imperial Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg in an infamous statement. He said, when asked why Germany was not going to intervene to help the Armenians, quote, "Our only aim is to keep Turkey on our side until the end of the war, no matter whether as a result Armenians perish or not," unquote. Could Germany under a successor government with a different policy, have intervened to stop the genocide? In the view of General Eckhard Liesek, a retired German general with experience in Turkey and author of books on the war, even if Berlin had changed policy and broken the alliance with Turkey, that would not have stopped the genocide. Indeed, he thinks it would have been worse because there would have been no criticism, no restraint. There would have had to be a viable opposition power inside Turkey which could depose the Young Turk regime, and there was none. What about the other great powers, Britain or the United States under Woodrow Wilson? Joseph Pomiankowski, the Austro-Hungarian military plenipotentiary and collaborator of Liman, believed that the United States could have acted, indeed, that the mere threat of war by Wilson against Turkey would have had a deterrent effect. But when America finally did enter the war, it was not against Turkey. As for Liman personally, the drama does not end with his liberation. He was, as the record shows, one of the few German officers who used his powers to save lives. But at the same time, he publicly declared that all German military officers were innocent, although he knew personally of the complicity and outright collaboration of General Bronzat von Schellendorf, for example, who signed a deportation order, naval attaché Hans Humann, and several others. In his post-war writings and in his testimony delivered at the 1921 trial of Soghomon Tehlirian, the Armenian avenger who assassinated Talat Pasha, Liman categorically denied any German participation in the atrocities. Why? Above all, Liman considered himself a man of honor. The term runs like a leitmotif throughout his writings and recorded statements. He demanded respect for his rank as general. He was insulted, if not seated appropriately at a formal dinner. He suffered the disrespectful treatment meted out to him as prisoner as much out of honor as out of concern for the unlawfulness of his arrest. That he had been accused of atrocities was an attack on his honor. And the fact that the German elite did not adequately protect him and rectify this, in his view, was a disgrace. Honor was the man's middle name. Although biographical material is scant, his notebooks were confiscated by the British. Others stored in imperial archives in Potsdam were destroyed by bombings in 1945. Liman's cultural, ideological, and moral development can indeed be reconstructed. He was a Protestant, descendant of converted Jews, who had played a role in the reform movement shaped by Moses Mendelssohn. From a very well-to-do family, he received the very best education that Germany had to offer. He attended the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium high school. The humanist education that he got there had been developed by reformer and statesman Wilhelm von Humboldt, whose method, by the way, was also adopted here in the United States at the time, in the 19th century. It was not based on imparting particular knowledge, particularized knowledge, but on developing the moral and intellectual qualities or the character of the individual as a future citizen. The study of ancient and modern languages, science, and history, particularly Prussian history, stressed patriotism and so-called Prussian virtues: honor, duty, responsibility, dependability, and so on. Through his training at the Prussian War Academy, he continued study of the humanities and science, as well as military subjects. Although honor was not a course of study, it pervaded every branch of study at the Academy. The military honor code demanded fulfillment of the oath of allegiance to God, King, and Fatherland. It meant following the rules of conducting warfare to protect civilians, but also observing honorable conduct, showing courage, determination, truthfulness, discretion, esprit de corps, and fulfillment of duty. The soldier was bound to obey his superior. However, that did not preclude the possibility that independent individual judgment might prevail. To cite one example provided by Prince Friedrich Karl von Preußen in the 19th century, a university graduate and reformer who focused on developing the moral qualities of an officer. The officer, he wrote, acts on the basis of an idea, and that idea, quote, was honor. To illustrate the concept of honor, he cited a historical document that was given out by the king to every officer. And in this document it stated, quote, the officer owes obedience to his superior unless it is against his honor, unquote. And the same reformer is remembered for his saying, quote, sir, the king has made you into a staff officer so that you know when you should not obey, unquote. In other words, individual judgment prevails. In short, individual honor, individual judgment can be superior and can challenge obedience to hierarchical rigidity. The military honor code demanded subservience to the Kaiser and the fatherland to defend their honor. Esprit de corps meant defending the honor of the collective assembly, all the other soldiers and officers. Only the exceptional individual with internalized moral principles could challenge authority and exert sovereign freedom of choice. Liman chose to challenge this evil policy, to intervene and save innocent lives. Bronsart von Schellendorf and others did not. The paradox in Liman is that his deep-rooted sense of honor led him also to cover up for his crimes of the other military. Here, it was not personal honor, but the honor of the fatherland and esprit de corps. Liman von Sanders tried to defend both. The complex, perhaps tragic case of Liman von Sanders is, I believe, still relevant. In the various theaters of war in our world today that I mentioned at the onset, we witness violence and brutality, unspeakable suffering of women, children, old, and the sick. The UN and human rights organizations are crying out in protest and have placed the word genocide back on the agenda, appealing to the powers that be to intervene as required by the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. Military personnel in the field, as well as the political class at home, face this moral challenge. Then, as now, the fate of entire populations depends on their choice. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to sit down, if I may. Can I sit down over here? And could I have this also? Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. No, you're very kind. So, if you have any questions, please. Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes, yes, Sarah.
What role did if any, did the Jewish background of von Sanders play in his thinking and honor, or was that completely subsumed when his grandparents converted? They cut all ties and became completely assimilated as Germans. Did he have any?
Thank you. The question is, what role did his Jewish background play in his actions and decisions? It's a very important question. I tried to figure it out, but it's sort of difficult. Anyway, what I found out is, first, as I mentioned, his great-great-grandfather was the one who first converted to Christianity. And his 5 sons also converted and married into converted Jewish families and so on. Liman himself grew up as a Protestant, as I said, and he married a German Protestant woman who died in 1906. later, after the war, when he returned to Germany, he remarried a young woman he met in Berlin, an artist who was from a Jewish family. She converted, actually, after she had met him, and they were married in a church and in a civil ceremony. There's no record that I could find of any writings of his on the question of Jewry, the Jewish religion, or his Jewish tradition. But it's known that the general staff in the Prussian military was rabidly anti-Semitic. In fact, I quoted a document of it done by a Bundestag, a parliamentary investigative committee on anti-Semitism in the First World War in the military. And it was rabid. In fact, Lehmann was one of only 3 officers of that rank who was of Jewish background. The people who opposed him and his policies in Turkey, many of them were also rabid anti-Semites. And it's known that a number of the anti-Armenians would say the Armenians were worse than the Jews. So this mood, this climate of adversity or hostility to him as a Jew was very, very prevalent. That may very well have reinforced his impulse, but I think the actual impulse came from his education, his upbringing, and the better part of that era in German history. Yes.
I had read some time ago, a long time ago, I can't remember the name of the book, that the Germans' problem with the Armenians began in the 1890s when they planned to build a railroad to the oil fields of Baku, and the Armenians happened to be in the way. Am I remembering that correctly, or anything you know about that history?
I'm sorry, I don't know. I simply don't know.
Okay. I guess my second question, given what you described about the general and the conflict between what's right and what's, quote, honorable, how do you see that playing out in today's United States? To what extent is what's going on today a conflict among some high officials between what's right, I can't even say what's honorable, it's sort of what's obligation to the supreme leader. So what's the lesson from that period to today?
I tried to make it implicit. You'd like to make it explicit. It seems to me that in times of crisis, like the crises that we're living through today, and not only the political crisis in the United States, which is itself horrendous and unprecedented, but also, as I mentioned, the wars going on in the 21st century. The question is, who has the guts to stand up and oppose it? And I think the lesson of Lehmann von Sanders is you don't have to. He was a commander, he was a general, he had power. But he did not have the power that was ascribed to him to stop the genocide, unfortunately. But he used whatever power he could, whatever power he had. He used whatever avenues he had to intervene and to help the Armenians, the Jews, and the Greeks who were being persecuted. And the question today is, the question often asked here in the United States is, where is the opposition? Where are the people who are willing to stand up no matter what the consequences might be for what they know to be right? And I think that's the case also in some of these war theaters, for example, in Palestine. It's known there are numbers of Israeli soldiers, reservists, and others who are being called up to wage war on the West Bank against Palestinians or in Gaza, and who are refusing. There are resistors also among the Russian military who are being sent into this war in Ukraine. There are Ukrainians who are refusing to serve, and so on. So it is ultimately a question of individual judgment and courage. And I think one reason why I was very happy to come upon this case was that it provides a wonderful example of what can be done and what should be done despite extraordinary circumstances. Yes?
Question. Although von Saunders himself, I guess, died in the 1920s or 1929, I think. Did any of the younger officers who maybe served with him in Turkey at the time, by the time of World War II, rise to higher ranks? Is there any evidence from sort of those who served under him in Turkey who then made it into the, I guess, the Nazi sort of...
Yeah. Very good question. I should repeat the question because I'm sure it wasn't heard. The question is whether any of the officers or military in the German ranks during the First World War who survived, I mean, who were young enough to live into the period in the 1930s when Hitler came to power, if they also rose in the ranks of the Nazi. I haven't really pursued this, but I know that a number of military people did indeed join the Nazi Party. And this is one of the issues that's raised in Germany whenever you mention the name Prussia or Prussian. And in fact, there's a wonderful, if I can find it here, there's a wonderful quote in the Encyclopedia Britannica, I believe, on Prussianism, where they say that, here it is, they say indeed that the Prussian mentality of discipline and obedience and all this kind of what I described as honor to God, the fatherland, and so on, that this actually was the basis for the Nazi ideology. Right? In fact, Hitler named it the Third Reich. The Hohenzollern dynasty was the Second Empire. So, and indeed, there are personal cases which prove the point that you're making. But it's not a question of automatism. One could have been brought up in a Prussian cultural environment and been a liberal reformer and thinker. There were many. And others went into the Nazi Party. Yes?
I'd like you to address the issue of reparations. Germany has always been pro-Turkish for the last 100 or so years. And even only a few years ago, up to a few years ago, it hadn't recognized the genocide. So, Hitler was a great admirer of Ataturk, too. Mm-hmm. There's books on this. So I think Armenians should pursue reparations against Germany. Now, it needs to be started very slowly to educate Armenians, but I think this can be done. I've talked to Armenian organizations a bit about this. They're not interested, but I think this is something we should pursue. What do you think?
The question, just let me repeat it for those who didn't hear your question. The question relates to the reparations that Germany, of course, has paid reparations. You didn't mention it, but to Israel for the Holocaust. And Turkey, of course, has never paid reparations or even acknowledged the genocide. And the question is whether, since Germany, if I understood correctly, was involved, whether or not it would be wise or feasible for Armenian organizations to pursue reparations or to demand reparations from the German government to Armenians. I'm not familiar with this idea, and I wonder on what actual legal basis it could be defined, because the debate about German responsibility in the genocide in the First World War is ongoing. Professor Dadron, Dr. Dadron, was the first, I think, who really extensively explored this. And recently, on the occasion of the centenary, 2015, there were a number of books in Germany, also outside Germany, that picked up this issue and explored it again. How much were the Germans involved? They were involved as individuals, as some perhaps as groups, but it was not a question of the policy. It was, for one thing, guilt by by omission. Guilt by omission. Germany could have done a lot. They couldn't have stopped the genocide, but they could have done a lot to intervene. For example, I'll give you an example. There was one Metternich, Wolf Metternich, an ambassador who was deployed to Turkey, and he was a very strong opponent of the genocide. And he wrote to Berlin, and he demanded, or proposed, that the government deploy him, actually order him to write an op-ed, an extensive article to be published in leading German newspapers on the genocide, documenting what the Young Turks were doing, and so on and so forth, and calling on Germany to intervene and, to make this a big case. It was in answer to this proposal by Metternich that Bethmann Hollweg came out with his infamous statement where he says, look, we want to stay in the war. We want Turkey to stay in the war with us as allies until it's ended. We don't care whether the Armenians perish or not. So that was the attitude. And you can say that proves complicity, that proves guilt, etc. But to what extent that, again, legally would provide the basis for reparations, I simply don't know. I'm not in the position to judge. It's an interesting idea. I think more important would be, for me, as an Armenian, I think it would be more important to force Turkey to recognize the genocide, because non-recognition is a form of continuation of the genocide. And reparations or non-reparations could be discussed after that. But this is, for me, the key issue, not so much German representation, because that's, in a certain sense, changing the subject. Any other? Yes?
You mentioned you mentioned a proposal to send Jews to the Caucasus.
Yeah.
What would be the purpose of that?
To use them as cannon fodder. Because in 1914, in the first Caucasus campaign, Enver, who was considered himself a brilliant strategist, but actually was nothing of the kind, organized the first Caucasus campaign. And that was in winter. So he apparently had not read about Napoleon or anybody else who tried to move against the Russians. And he demanded that Liman von Sanders lead this campaign as a commander. And Liman, who was a very competent strategist and military thinker, said no. He said the Turkish troops are absolutely inadequately supplied and trained to take any kind of initiative in this direction. But Enver went ahead, and Schellendorf became his commander. And you probably know the story of what happened. I think there were 100,000 troops that they sent on this winter campaign into the Caucasus to reach the Russians and destroy them and so on. About 95,000 died, not from enemy fire, but because they had no shoes, they had no food, they had no communications, they had no water. This was in the dead of winter. Yeah. So Liman knew that. So later, when he was in Palestine, and he got an order to send the Jews who were part of his group, and also the Jews were also very important for the German military as translators, as were the Armenians, very competent in translations. So Liman, hearing this, said, "No way! I'm not going to send these men to die in the Caucasus," and that was that.
So they were members of the German army?
No, it was members of the Ottoman Empire. They were Jews in Palestine, Ottoman Palestine, and they were conscripts. They were troops, and there was a 6th, 7th, and 8th Army who had a large Jewish component because it was in Palestine. They were recruited there. Any more questions? Did you have a question? Hi, Harry. No. Well, if there are no more questions, then I guess it's time for me to say thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest. We do have books here for anybody who is interested in purchasing one. And I think there's also refreshments, food. Everybody is invited to join. Thank you so much for coming.